The queen's blade was descending toward my neck when her 7-year-old daughter threw herself between us and screamed the sacred words of the guardian ritual. I choose him, and I watched the most powerful woman in the Empire freeze mid-swing because her child had just made a human prisoner part of the royal family. The execution platform, silent except for my heavy breathing, was filled with thousands of Vel'Kari warriors. They had come to witness my end, their eyes unblinking as they stared down at me kneeling on cold stone. I closed my eyes, trying to imagine anything else. Home, a distant memory of sunlight through tree leaves, back when the world seemed full of hope, and not this endless void. The blade began its descent again, glinting under whatever light filtered into the enclosed space below the platform's canopy. The crowd held their breath, as if waiting for my final heartbeat to echo out loud enough for them all to hear it die. Then came a child's scream cutting through like fire. Stop! Followed by small feet thundering across stone, and then silence. I didn't understand what was happening until I saw her. Princess Lyra, 7 years old with hair the color of snowflakes falling in moonlight, standing tall before me despite being shorter than half my height. Her tiny body shielded mine from view as she faced Queen Seraphine directly, no trace of fear on those wide eyes. I choose him, she shouted again, her voice ringing out clear and strong against the shocked murmur that rose from around us. My heart stopped cold in my chest at her words. What kind of magic was this child weaving? Lyra. Seraphine's tone held a mix of disbelief and deep emotion I couldn't quite place. Move now. But Lyra didn't budge an inch. I invoke the guardian ritual, she declared solemnly. I choose this human as my protector. Seraphine's hand, holding her blade so close to us, both it could have nicked a strand of Lyra's hair with any slight slip in her grip, wavered visibly now. Her eyes flickered between me and her daughter, shock evident on each side. Lyra met her mother's gaze steadily. I know exactly what I am saying. Turning back towards me, confusion etched into every line of my face, must have been obvious in the light from above, because Lyra reached out a small hand to take hold of mine. You do not know what you are saying, the queen tried again, but there was no steel left behind those words, only uncertainty that she couldn't hide from anyone who witnessed this moment. The gesture caught us both off guard for different reasons. Hers a simple act of trust and bravery, mine shock at being pulled suddenly so deeply into this alien girl's life. He made me laugh even after all others left. The little princess squeezed my hand tighter, looking up at me with those earnest eyes of hers before turning back towards Seraphine again. I am choosing him officially. Every warrior around us seemed to hold their collective breath as if they too understood the gravity and finality of what was happening. He told me stories when I was scared, she explained calmly, though everyone could hear the tremble in her voice that betrayed how difficult speaking these words must have been. He played games with me when I felt lonely. No one spoke out against Lyra's choice. No arguments, protests, or requests for reconsideration were raised, even from within this elite group who had come today specifically to see me executed. An enemy. But Lyra shook hers just the same way. More fiercely, perhaps because of how small she looked compared with everyone else here around us, but defiant nonetheless against any objections that would be made to take away her right. Now, Seraphine lowered her blade slowly now, shaking her head in disbelief as she let it rest finally on its guard again. Lyra, he is a prisoner, and from this moment forward, he is more. With the strength of a little girl who had just defied one of their most powerful rulers in favor of someone they cared about deeply, an act witnessed by all assembled here today, including those tasked with enforcing her decisions, Lyra turned back to look up at me once again. I will explain everything. That's what friends do. Seraphine sheathed her blade finally after another long moment staring down between us now, as if seeing something completely different about this scene from the one which had begun just moments ago. Sentence was still being carried out in full view of all assembled. Now you cannot. I gazed down at Lyra's small hand holding mine, feeling a warmth spread through me, despite everything else that had just transpired around us, from the crowd's murmurs of shock and awe to the realization dawning in Seraphine's eyes as she stepped back away from this sudden change in fate, which could only mean one thing for her daughter now. "He's my friend," she corrected firmly, releasing me only briefly long enough to reach out and tug on my arm until I was standing too. "Congratulations, Queen Seraphine," said softly, but with clear authority. "You are going to die." Princess Lyra, by invoking the guardian ritual, had claimed me as part of their royal family. No matter how much it might seem like an impossible turn of events, given who Seraphine paced like a caged predator across this austere room, her silver skin glistening under the harsh fluorescent lighting. Her white hair fluttered around her shoulders as she moved back and forth, each step echoing off the metal walls. She was clearly in turmoil, her expression shifting from fury to confusion before settling on an unreadable mask of resignation. Jake sat under heavy guard, Vel'Kari warriors flanking him like sentinels, and watched Seraphine with a mixture of fear and resolve. Lyra refused to leave his side. She clung tightly to one of the guards, her eyes never leaving Jake's face as if reassuring herself he was still there. Seraphine finally came to an abrupt halt before them. "Explain," she commanded in a voice that echoed through the chamber like thunder. "How does my daughter know you?" Jake cleared his throat and met Seraphine's gaze with surprising calm. 3 months ago, Lyra found her way to the prison levels. He paused for a moment, recalling the day their fates first intertwined. "Curious about humans, I suppose?" Seraphine's expression darkened momentarily before she urged him on. "She came back again and again," Jake continued. "No one else played with her. No attendants were brave enough to tell her stories or engage in simple conversation." He shrugged, his voice steady despite the weight of his words. "I had nothing but time, so I talked to her when she visited. We told tales from Earth, of rabbits and tortoises, dragons and knights." Lyra tugged on one of Jake's hands, drawing him back into their shared memory with a small smile. Seraphine's eyes flickered between father and daughter, narrowing as if searching for hidden motives or deceptions in both sets of features. "You befriended my daughter," she stated more than asked. Jake nodded once, his tone firm yet gentle. "She was lonely, Seraphine. I wasn't trying to be her savior. I just wanted someone to talk to, too." Lyra leaned into him then, her small frame pressing against Jake's side for comfort and support. "He never used me," she added quietly, but with conviction. Her eyes flashed up at the Queen before settling back on Jake. Seraphine turned abruptly towards Lyra, who stood resolutely by Jake's side. "Is this true?" she asked slowly, almost hesitantly now that her initial shock was fading into something more contemplative. Lyra nodded vigorously, looking straight ahead with unshakable resolve in those wide green eyes that mirrored Seraphine's own, but held a warmth and innocence she had never seen before. "He's the only adult who ever treated me like me," Lyra explained softly yet clearly enough for all present to hear her every word. "He told stories when I was scared, played games with me when lonely," she continued without pause, releasing Jake's hand long enough to gesture towards him emphatically. "Made laugh even after others left." Seraphine's jaw tightened at this admission before loosening again as if the realization of what had happened started sinking in bit by painful bit. She looked back down then from Lyra's determined face over to Jake, who stood quietly waiting her next move. "You are now responsible for her safety, education, and well-being," Seraphine stated, finally turning fully towards him once more with authority that cut through the tension like ice against stone. "You hold parental authority second only to mine." Jake's mind froze at these words before slowly processing their implications, responsibilities he never expected or desired, but could not deny given Lyra's decision. "Her what?" His voice came out almost as a whisper, shock resonating in each syllable. Lyra beamed up at him with infectious joy. "You are my guardian now. Like in the stories." Jake gazed down at this child who had just made him royalty to save his life. He reached for her hand again, squeezing it tightly without breaking eye contact with Seraphine, whose expression held an unreadable mix of emotions: confusion, anger, and something else he couldn't quite place but was slowly recognizing. "Lyra, did you do this just to stop the execution?" Jake asked gently, though his mind raced through every possible consequence her choice might bring them both into now. She shook her head vigorously again with that same unyielding spirit. "I chose because of how I felt," she insisted quietly, almost shyly, as if speaking out in public was already difficult enough even here, amongst their own kind. "You never saw me differently than any other child." Seraphine's expression softened slightly, but only for a moment, before the queen stepped closer again to where they stood, framed by her guards and Jake's protectors now too. "You are going to die," Seraphine said quietly this time, but with clear authority, as if needing to reassert control over proceedings that seemed out of hand even to herself. "Now you cannot." Jake looked up from Lyra, weeks passed in a blur of adjustments and adaptation for Commander Jake Sullivan, once destined to die at dawn, but now reborn into an unexpected role as guardian to Princess Lyra Vel'Kari. His days were filled with rigorous training sessions, lessons in Vel'Kari culture and language, and the delicate task of forging a bond between him and Lyra while navigating the intricate politics of the Vel'Kari court. The palace was abuzz with whispers whenever Jake appeared alongside Lyra. He had become an unlikely figurehead for rebellion against tradition, a human who dared to challenge their rigid customs by genuinely caring about their young princess, something no one else seemed willing or capable of doing. An imposing figure with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue, he saw Jake not just as competition for influence over Princess Lyra, but as an interloper who should never have been allowed to touch Vel'Kari soil, let alone their royal loyalty. Family. The guards watched him closely as he navigated the grand halls and training grounds, ever vigilant, but also curious. High General Krath was a constant presence in Jake's life since Lyra's declaration. One afternoon, during a particularly tense sparring session in the palace training grounds, Krath cornered Jake. "You manipulated my sister's daughter," he accused through gritted teeth. Jake set his sword down and turned to face him directly. "No manipulation happened here," he replied calmly but firmly. "I told her stories. She made her own choice." Krath sneered, a contemptuous expression twisting his features. A child too young to understand the gravity of such decisions is easily swayed by flattery and false promises. His eyes narrowed with suspicion and anger. Jake shrugged nonchalantly, but there was no mistaking the steel in his voice. "Maybe I did what your mother should have done a long time ago, cared for her child instead of training them to be warriors from birth." The High General's face turned red with fury at this slight against Seraphine's parenting methods. He clenched and unclenched his fists, restrained only by the knowledge that he could not touch Jake directly without causing a diplomatic incident. "You are not worthy of the guardian title," Krath spat finally before turning on his heel to storm away from the human who had managed to outmaneuver him in one fell swoop by winning over their princess's heart and loyalty. Jake watched as Krath disappeared around a corner, knowing he needed to be more vigilant than ever now. The High General's words rang true. They were not unwarranted accusations, but reflections of how the Vel'Kari society viewed this change at its core. It was an affront to their very way of life and structure. Training sessions became even more intense after that confrontation, each one a potential setup for Krath's revenge plot. Jake had served in enough military conflicts back on Earth to recognize when someone was planning something sinister under the guise of everyday activities like sparring or drills. One fateful day during Lyra's afternoon training session, a regular routine meant to improve her combat skills and awareness. Jake felt an unexplainable tension ripple through him as they sparred with wooden practice swords. The moment seemed frozen in time before a blur caught his peripheral vision. A dark figure moving swiftly towards them, intent on causing harm. Without hesitation, Jake shielded Lyra behind himself, just as the assassin's blade sliced down where she had been standing moments earlier. Instinct took over. He fought off and captured the would-be murderer while keeping Lyra out of immediate danger. Medics rushed in amidst chaos to attend to both victim and attacker. In those critical seconds, Jake glanced at Lyra, who was crying silently as if she couldn't believe her guardian had once again saved her life, despite facing impossible odds yet again. Seraphine arrived soon after hearing the commotion from a distance through palace corridors lined with guards and servants rushing about on command. Her arrival brought order to the chaotic scene where medics were now examining Jake's wound while interrogating the captured assassin for details of his mission, clearly aimed at removing an unwanted human presence by any means necessary. Her eyes met Jake's tired gaze as he lay wounded but conscious, blood seeping from a deep gash across his shoulder. He confesses, one medic reported urgently to her without breaking eye contact with the queen. Again! Jake managed a weak smile through gritted teeth, wincing from his injury, but offering reassurance to the princess beside him. That's what guardians do. Seraphine stepped closer now that everything had been taken care of and her child was safe once more. Lyra clung tightly onto Jake's hand even now that she wasn't physically in danger anymore. She looked up at Seraphine pleadingly before addressing him again. "You saved me." She bent down slightly on one knee so she could look directly into Jake's eyes without towering over them both, their positions remarkably equal despite the difference in status. "You will live," Seraphine commanded firmly, yet with a surprising gentleness not often seen from this cold-hearted ruler who seemed immune to such displays of emotion otherwise. Her gaze drifted momentarily back towards their daughter now, a silent acknowledgement that Jake's heart swelled as he gazed at the young girl who had chosen him over everything else, over tradition, her mother's expectations, even death itself. She ordered her medical team forward again decisively to ensure his survival at all costs, rather than allowing nature's course, after witnessing how far he had gone already for Lyra's safety. He carefully squeezed her fingers back before turning his attention toward the door where footsteps approached quietly. Seraphine entered, moving with an eerie grace despite the turmoil within. The queen's silver skin seemed almost luminous in the dim light of the medical wing as she observed Jake and Lyra for a moment from the doorway. She then walked over to take a seat in another chair opposite them without disturbing their sleep. Her presence was weighty, but there was an unfamiliar quietness about her that made him pause. "She refused to leave," Seraphine began softly, almost under her breath, as if speaking more to herself than anyone else present. "Threw a tantrum worthy of a warrior." Jake smiled weakly, still feeling the lingering effects of pain and medication from his wound, but also touched by Lyra's fierce loyalty. "She is stubborn," he murmured. Seraphine turned those intense eyes toward him, studying Jake with an unaccustomed intensity that made him feel exposed yet oddly understood at the same time. She continued after a momentary silence, her tone pondering and reflective. "I have ruled for 30 years, she admitted quietly. "I thought I understood strength." Her gaze drifted to Lyra once more before returning back to Jake's own. "My daughter taught me that I was wrong." Jake didn't know what to say in response as Seraphine continued her thoughts aloud, breaking down the rigid walls of formality between them, for perhaps the first time since he'd arrived at Vel'Kari. "Strength is not the blade," she said finally with a quiet certainty. "It is what you protect with it." Jake's mind raced to comprehend this new revelation from the queen, whose life had been defined by war and power struggles. He felt as if he were standing on unfamiliar ground, trying to grasp why his actions, a human prisoner of war who befriended her daughter, could have such an impact. You had nothing to gain, Seraphine continued, by befriending my child. You had everything to lose by protecting her. Jake could feel the weight of those words as she spoke them directly into a silence that felt charged with newfound understanding between them. The queen rose gracefully from her seat and moved toward the door, but paused again before leaving. I do not understand humans, Seraphine confessed, looking back at him one last time with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. But I am beginning to understand you. With those final words, she left Jake alone once more with Lyra's sleeping form beside him. As the door closed softly behind her, a palpable sense of change lingered in the air. Moments later, Lyra stirred awake from where she had been resting against his bed. Her large eyes blinked sleepily before focusing on him again clearly. Is Mother angry? She asked hesitantly. Jake shook his head slowly with a small smile tugging at his lips despite lingering discomfort. I think she is figuring things out, he replied, trying to convey reassurance through the simple truth of her situation, now changing rapidly underfoot. Lyra's face brightened into a relieved grin, as if confirming what Jake had just shared. She climbed carefully onto his bed beside him, mindful not to disturb any medical equipment or aggravate his injuries further. She is slow sometimes, she admitted with an endearing shrug of her small shoulders. But she learns. Jake held out both arms gently, inviting Lyra closer, even as he winced slightly from movement near the wound on his shoulder. He pulled her close, despite it, and she snuggled against him gratefully. I am glad I chose you, she whispered honestly into his chest, where they were resting together like this. Something never before considered possible now that Jake had become more than just another human prisoner in Vel'Kari eyes. I'm glad you did too, kiddo. As Lyra slipped back to sleep against him once more, content and safe, Jake watched Seraphine's retreating figure at the door of the medical wing for what it truly represented. A shift in an empire's perspective, a glimmering light where darkness had long reigned. Jake tightened his hold on the little girl who had changed everything. The enemy who was about to die now saw as family those he guarded. And perhaps most importantly of all, a Vel'Kari queen started understanding that Jake's story didn't fit into their rigid customs, but carved its own path through compassion and care. Lyra chose well indeed, even if no one expected it. Especially him,